everyone. On behalf of the Center for Israel Studies, my name is Michael Brenner, and together with Laura Cutler, we organize this event as well as a number of other events here at the center. You can see them if you didn't take it yet in the newsletter. As you know, all of these events are free. Well, they're not really free. They cost us, of course, something, but they're free because we have a lot of supporters and donors, and if you want to help us support it, you'll find an envelope in the newsletter. So let me welcome all of you. It's really a special occasion tonight, celebrating a paperback edition of a relatively new book, which is already out in paperback, and also the presence of an outstanding colleague who is here from Israel for this year and I think for another year. So I would like to welcome you today to our event about the struggle for Israel, the struggle for the establishment of Israel in the preceding decades. Preceding means preceding state of 1948. The question over which event should get most credit for the establishment of the state of Israel has been asked a lot of times. Was it the Zionist longing for the ancient homeland? Was it the Holocaust? Was it the largely peaceful struggle of some, or the violence and terror of some others, which enabled or was the decisive element for the establishment of Israel? And we're lucky to have with us tonight two leading experts to discuss this crucial chapter of Israeli and Jewish history. Bruce Hoffman is the director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the United States Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. His recent book, Anonymous Soldiers, The Struggle for Israel, 1917 to 1947, investigates mainly the right-wing groups, the Irgun and Lehi, these movements and their struggle for Israeli independence. It was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and in his review in the Washington Post, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Daniel Kurtzer, called the book an indispensable source for understanding why Zionism succeeded. And as I mentioned before, the paperback version of the book is just fresh out of the press, and you can purchase it after the talk tonight, just as you're welcome to purchase copies of Professor Morris's groundbreaking works about the 0 hour of Israeli history. Benny Morris is professor in the Middle Eastern Studies Department of Ben Gurion University, and currently holds the Goldman Visiting Israeli Professorship, Georgetown University's Department of Government. His books, The Origins of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949, and to mention but two, and 1948, A History of the First Israeli-Arab War, are considered the authoritative writings on the birth of Israel and the ensuing conflict. Just a few words about tonight. So we will have both speakers, I would ask both speakers to speak about 15 minutes. Afterwards, the three of us will be here on the panel. I'll ask a few questions we'll discuss on the panel, and then we have room for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Professors Hoffman and Morris.
Thank you, Michael, for that extremely kind introduction to American University, both Israel Studies and the School of Public Affairs, for the invitation to come speak tonight. You know, I should point out that I'm a little bit of a fraud, especially standing at this podium next to Benny Morris, who's, of course, the foremost historian of the foundations of the State of Israel and indeed of Middle Eastern history. I'm not a Middle Eastern or even a Zionist historian. Actually, I'm a terrorism specialist. And it was really from that perspective that I wrote this book. It was less to offer some definitive interpretation of how the State of Israel was created, but rather to assess what role terrorism and political violence plays in achieving fundamental political change. And I've been studying terrorism now for 40 years. I first went to graduate school in 1976. I have to admit that it's a singularly depressing vocation because it's a phenomena that only has gotten worse and has exceeded even our direst predictions when I first began 4 decades ago. But it was always this question of whether terrorism can be successful or not that has perplexed me in the study of this, subject. And it's an especially, I think, important question because, of course, terrorism's victims and governments throughout the world persistently maintain that terrorism is a failed strategy, that terrorism is a singularly unsuccessful, unpropitious means to achieve political change. But at the same time, terrorism's practitioners and apologists maintain that it is an effective strategy. And as a longtime student of terrorism, I come to the question, well, if terrorism is so ineffective, why has it persisted for the past 2 millennia? And in fact, why has it become an increasingly popular, and one has to, I think, depressingly say, even more depressingly intractable feature of international relations and domestic politics in the 21st century? So this was really the reason that I set out to write this book, and it was because I thought a case study that examines in detail how terrorism, how political violence coming from both Jews and Arabs affected British policy and decision-making in Palestine would shed light on this question. And in this sense, The Birth of Israel is really almost an ideal case study, and that's because of the wealth of archival material that's available in the United Kingdom, in Israel, I want to say in the United States as well, at the National Archives and Records Service in College Park, Maryland, and also really with a voluminous collection of private and personal papers that also is available for scholarly inspection in those 3 countries. And then there's another unique dimension to this that informed the book. The United Kingdom, I would argue, is unique in the annals of governments throughout the world in making available in its archives documents of its security service. So the documents and archives of the British Security Service, MI5, are available to scholars and can be consulted. And that, of course, I think fills in a gap that one has often seen in history, where there's any number of perspectives, books written from the perspectives of military or diplomatic history, social history, cultural history, but there's actually a paucity of books that are written from the perspective of the role that intelligence plays in decision and policy making. And it's comparatively rare that one has the opportunity to actually delve into that. And it's the intelligence archives that make up a large part of the book. So I think really to understand the role of violence in Israel's creation, that's one side of the coin. One has to look at the other side of the coin, which is really the focus of my book, and that's to understand how violence and terrorism affected British policy and decision-making for its mandate in Palestine. And here I think you have to start from the truism that Britain never had a consistent policy for Palestine, and this rendered it susceptible to the pressure, to the blandishments, to the threats, to the cajoling, to the lobbying of one side or the other. And of course, one reason that Britain never had a consistent policy for Palestine is because, of course, 2 conflicting promises formed the basis of British rule in Palestine. In 1915, the High Commissioner of Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, had written to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, soliciting his participation in World War I on the side of the Allied powers against the Central powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and of course the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This is captured, at least popularly, in the film in the film Lawrence of Arabia, and I suppose somewhat fictionally as well in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And then, of course, 2 years later, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which in fact was a note written by the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, one of the presidents of the Zionist organization, in which Britain pledged to facilitate the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. Britain conquers Palestine, or conquers Jerusalem in 1917. The following year consolidates its rule over Palestine, and shortly afterwards allows Jews to immigrate to Palestine, literally without restriction, although the number of immigrants at that time is actually barely a trickle. Almost immediately, Palestine's Arab inhabitants become fearful that their country is going to be overrun by Jews. And this results in 1920 in serious rioting in Jerusalem. There's a brief period of quiescence. More widespread rioting breaks out in Tel Aviv the following year and spreads to the surrounding countryside. And this is the first time Britain reacts. And Britain's reaction, firstly, is to scale back its commitment to the Jewish national home by creating, and then imposing the principle of economic absorptive capacity, that henceforth Jewish immigrants could only be admitted to Palestine in conjunction with the country's ability to absorb those immigrants. The first High Commissioner for Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, himself a very prominent Zionist, an Anglo-Jew, perhaps mindful of his background and his important role in the Balfour Declaration, doubtless to demonstrate his impartiality, pardons the ringleader of the 1920 riots, Haj Amin al-Husseini, appoints him Mufti of Jerusalem, hoping that the trappings of being the senior Muslim religious figure responsible for Palestine will moderate Haj Amin, appoints him also president of the Supreme Muslim Council, and this, of course, is one of the most well-intentioned but disastrously consequential political appointments, doubtless, that has ever been made, because henceforth Haj Amin al-Husseini remains at the vortex of all the most significant acts of violence that convulse Palestine over the next 2 decades. As I argue in the book, he is the first modern embodiment of someone who fused together religion and politics that appealed to people, not just in abstract political nationalist terms, but used the very visceral, emotional responses that religion generates to mobilize the Palestinian Arab population of Palestinian Arab population to engage in the 1929 riots, which are a much more systemic and widespread uprising that results in the deaths of over 130 Jews. The first of 22 commissions is sent to Palestine by the British to try to divine some political resolution to the conflicting Arab and Jewish claims to the country. It recommends a drastic scaling back or curtailment of the commitments to the Jewish national home. That's embodied in the Pasfield White Paper, named after the colonial secretary at the time, Lord Pasfield. At what appeared to be a serious juncture and a reversal of British policy, the Zionists and their friends in London are very successful in lobbying the first Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, to actually reverse the Pasfield White Paper, basically to renege on that statement of policy, to overturn the policy advanced by his own colonial secretary. And this is what is known in Palestinian law as the MacDonald Black Letter, which basically vitiates that. But it's just a matter of time in the 1930s, with the rise to Hitler, with the increase in Jewish immigration increases by about 80% between 1933 and 1935, that violence again breaks out. And this is the far more widespread, far more systemic, far more comprehensive outright rebellion against British rule, as well as an attempt to eviscerate the nascent Jewish national home in Palestine, embodied in the 1936 to 1939 Arab Rebellion. And of course, in 1939, on the eve of World War II, Britain could not afford to have its forces tied up maintaining internal security in Palestine. There were some 40,000 British troops in Palestine at the time. And in May 1939, Britain issues a new white paper, and this white paper actually sticks. It is not overturned or reversed. And this basically turns off Jewish immigration to Palestine as a sop to Jews, obviously, at their darkest hour. 75,000 Jewish families are allowed to emigrate to Palestine over the next 5 years under a very strict quota, but thereafter, any further Jewish immigration would be made dependent upon Arab consent. The following year, very stringent land transfers regulations are enacted that basically restricts the Jewish purchase of land in Palestine to only 5% of the country. And in the wake of the 1939 White Paper, a Jewish underground movement, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, or national military organization, rises up, and after 2 years of waging tit-for-tat, revenge and retaliatory attacks against the Arabs, now declares a revolt against British rule. And it's very interesting to look at the Irgun's propaganda and its explanation for this revolt at the time, and they're quite unambiguous. They say the Arabs use violence and terror, and the Arabs are winning. It's time for us to use the same violence. So this, I think, was the inherent problem of British rule is that both sides were always convinced that they could affect and influence British policy through the use of violence. And in the book, I think there's a very revealing exchange between the last High Commissioner for Palestine, Sir Alan Cunningham, and Golda Meirson, later Hebraicized her name to Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, where Cunningham complains. I mean, this has been the problem of 3 decades of British rule, is that both sides have convinced that violence can affect British policy. So very briefly, to put into context what the Irgun did, in my view, the Irgun was far more numerically larger than the Lehi, known to Jews by its acronym Lehi. The British called them the Stern Gang. Freedom Fighters for Israel is how their name would translate. The Irgun, I think, was the more consequential in affecting British policy, with one exception, and that was the assassination of Lord Moyne by Lehi in 1944, which, as the book discusses, basically scuttled a very ambitious partition plan, a plan by Winston Churchill to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. But the Irgun, as I said, played the more consequential role, and I think an underappreciated and had an unacknowledged influence over events. The Irgun, of course, was led by another future Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. His strategy was not to defeat Britain militarily. He understood that a terrorist group with limited firepower, with a small number of men, could not possibly challenge the might of the British Empire. But what he sought to do was undermine the government's prestige and control of the country by striking at symbols of British rule. And of course, one of the most infamous operations carried out by the Irgun was the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. Despite some popular mythology that depicts the King David Hotel as it is today as an ordinary hostelry, in 1946, indeed since 1938, the King David had been the nerve center of British rule in Palestine, housing not only the offices of the government secretariat in the southwestern wing, but also British military headquarters and the headquarters of the entire panoply of the British intelligence apparatus. Begin counted on a paradox where the more pervasive Britain's attempts to suppress the terrorists and violence became, the more powerful the Irgun appeared. And in this sense, I think it's important to note that in an era long before 24/7 global news coverage, Begin and the Irgun deliberately sought to appeal to a worldwide audience. This is what Begin described in his seminal book, The Revolt, as turning Palestine into a glass house with the world looking in, and hoping to marshal international pressure, appealing to an audience beyond the footlights, beyond the immediate locus of the terrorist campaign, but to an audience not just in London, Britain's capital, but in Moscow, in Paris, in Washington, D.C., and especially in New York, which of course was the home of the fledgling United Nations organization. And here I think to understand the Irgun's role, one has to see them as acting as an accelerant, as hastening a process that was doubtlessly unfolding in any event, but significantly leaving Britain with fewer options and less time to decide on the ultimate disposition of Palestine in a way that Britain would have preferred. So let me conclude and stay within my 15 minutes. History, at least in my view, is rarely monocausal. And let me use an example as someone who studied terrorism. The origins of World War I. It would be simplistic to say that World War I was caused by an act of terrorism, by the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914. Certainly World War I was a product of the Anglo-German trade and naval rivalries, of Russian nationalist ambitions to create a pan-Slavic empire in the Balkans, the efforts of the decaying Habsburg Empire to hold on to its colonial possessions in the Balkans. By the same token, the decaying Ottoman Empire's efforts to hold on to its own possessions, the interlocking alliances. I mean, there are any number of factors. But of course, we don't exclude the role, this important catalytic role that terrorism had in triggering World War I. And that's how I view really the place of the Jewish underground movements, or the right-wing underground movements, in the story of Israel's creation. The rise of Israel was, of course, the product of many powerful forces in addition to, and perhaps that were more important than terrorism: diplomacy, negotiation, lobbying, civil disobedience, information operations, illegal immigration, of course, certainly the plight of the survivors of the Holocaust, the hundreds of thousands of persons languishing in displaced persons camps throughout Europe, even 3 years after the end of World War II, was an enormously important factor, as indeed was President Truman's support of the creation of Israel, even against the advice of his own State Department and his own Secretary of State, George Marshall. Indeed, Arthur Creech Jones, who was the colonial secretary during this critical period, 2 decades later reflected on the events that forced Britain to leave Palestine, and he cited 4. First and foremost was the intractability of Arab and Jewish political differences, which of course remain even to this day. Secondly, of course, was Britain's constrained post-war finances that required it to maintain in Palestine 100,000 troops. That's more than double the number that were there during the Arab Rebellion, although the Arab Rebellion was a much more widespread and much more systemic uprising. In fact, there was 1 British soldier and policeman for every adult Jewish male in Palestine. So that was putting an enormous strain on Britain's post-war treasury. Third was the failure to enlist American support to arrive at some political solution of the Palestine problem, and hand in glove with that was the failure of the new Labour government elected in 1945 in Britain to arrive at some new policy to replace the 1939 White Paper. And fourthly, but he argued just as importantly, was terrorism, and particularly the acts of the Irgun that marshaled international pressure on the British, that marshaled international sympathy for the plight of the Jews, that focused attention on Palestine, that fulfilled, in essence, Begin's glass house strategy. So certainly I think that the case study of the book shows that, despite repeated government denials, that terrorism can, in the right conditions and with the appropriate strategy and tactics, succeed in advancing its practitioners' fundamental political agendas. Thank you very much.
Maybe a little better from there because it's a large, if you don't mind.
Well, Bruce has stolen some of my thunder, but I hope I have a little niche. I wanted to talk about the historiographic dispute in Israel. That is the argument among historians and in the general public as well, relating to history, about the role of the dissident organizations, the IZL and the Lehi, which Bruce talked about, in the creation of the State of Israel. Historical disputes often have a political meaning and a political purpose and resonance, and this certainly is true about various aspects of Israeli historiography. And this is a particularly sensitive subject for the Israeli political public, as well as for historians. For decades, Israel was governed between 1948, even before, of course, but certainly after the creation of Israel. It was governed by a labor-led coalition and basically by labor Mapai politicians, and its education system was run by Mapai politicians, and the universities were dominated by liberal and labor, but mainly labor-linked academics. And the whole historiographic community was essentially, in some way, an affiliate of the Labour Party and the Labour ideology. And their argument was, between 1948 and 1977, that is, the state, through its various educational agencies and the educational community, including its universities and historiographic community, the argument was that it was the labor movement, with its political agencies and leadership, and its military wing, the Haganah, which set up the State of Israel, which established the State of Israel. And they argued at the same time that their enemies on the right, before 48 and after 48, of course, their rivals in the political arena, the Cherut, as it was called, today's Likud, at the time revisionists, and with their military wing, the IZL and the Lehi in some way also attached, they argued that these were irrelevant and in fact in some way even were detrimental to the emergence of the State of Israel in the countdown to 1948. This was the labor movement's argument. The right, of course, Cherut, led by Begin, and the veterans of the Etzel, the IZL, of course, said that the labor was belittling the IZL's contribution for political reasons ongoing in the rivalry, the political rivalry of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. With the Likud's victory, it wasn't called the Likud then, but it's today called the Likud, with Begin's victory in 1977 in the general elections, the state came under the domination of right-wingers, many of them veterans of the IZL and the LHI, the education ministry. They even had some historians, though to this day there aren't very many Israeli historians who are attached to the right. It's essentially a left-wing preserve, but they still had a few hangers-on, some of them even real historians. And they began to promote from 1977 systematically through the education system a view that it was the IZL and the Lehi's operations pre-1948 that had really brought about the State of Israel, or at least the possibility for the establishment of the State of Israel. What they argued, in effect, was that it was the IZL and the LHI's terrorist attacks, I'm not sure the word terrorist, incidentally, is correct, against the British. Basically, they were arguing they were liberation fighters fighting against a foreign occupier. When they attacked Arabs, it's a different question, and they did target civilians. When they hit the British, they essentially targeted troops and police. So it could legitimately be called a national liberation struggle against the British. But they said that these attacks, including most prominently, as Bruce mentioned, the blowing up of part of the King David Hotel in 1946 and the hanging of 2 British sergeants in 1947, these were the 2 most prominent attacks, most prominent in the sense of a public echo and resonance in England itself. These are the things that led the British government to decide in February 47 to evacuate Palestine, and in the following months consolidated this decision so that in fact the British did hand over Palestine to the United Nations, and eventually the British left. So in fact, it was the IZL and the LHI which had driven out the foreign occupier, making possible the establishment of the State of Israel. This was their narrative, and this is what they propagated from 1977 into the school system, and as I say, by also historians and so on. Now, the labor argument was that the labor narrative and the argument against this, which continued among commentators more than even among historians, was that it was the Labor Party which had also, in fact, caused the evacuation, the decision to evacuate and the evacuation of the British government and forces. They had done this mainly through the illegal immigration campaign, which greatly embarrassed the British government. It involved many Holocaust survivors. They did this by persuading American public opinion to press the American government to support the emergence of a Zionist state. And of course, ultimately, it was the labor military organization, the Haganah, which beat the Arabs in the war. The Lehi and IZL's contribution to the first Arab-Israeli war of 1948 was very meager, almost insignificant, except perhaps the destruction or the massacre which occurred in Deir Yassin and the capture of part of Jaffa. These were the only significant contributions of the IZL to that war making against the Arabs, but essentially it was the Haganah which beat the Arabs, the Haganah and then the IDF. It's the same organization, incidentally, it simply changed its name on the 1st of June 1948. They were the ones who won the war, making possible the establishment and consolidation of the Jewish state. This was a labor argument. Now, the opening of the British archives in the 1990s, maybe even slightly earlier and afterwards, different parts were opened at different times. Bruce mentioned the intelligence service. This came late, the internal intelligence service, but the security service. But other parts were opened even before. But essentially, the opening of the British archives 30 and 40 and 50 years after the events, I think has reinforced the IZL, LHI, revisionist, Likud view of what drove out the British. And if you like, in some way, undermined the Labour explanation of what had happened. Because it was these vital, these crucial attacks on British troops, the blowing up of an officers' club, but essentially the destruction of the piercing of the Acre prison system, but essentially the destruction of the King David Hotel, and the hanging of the two sergeants, which changed the British public opinion, and essentially the public opinion forced the government to evacuate Palestine. There was, of course, always the problem, and this was mentioned, that the Foreign Secretary, the Colonial Secretary had also pointed to that as a problem for the British. They were unable to resolve the Zionist-Arab conflict. This was also driving eventually the British decision to evacuate, but it was these critical terrorist attacks which led incidentally to riots in places like Liverpool and Birmingham, the destruction of Jewish shops by crowds who were angry at what the Jews had done to their boys back in Palestine. These are the things that persuaded Bevin that this was untenable and that Britain must evacuate, and led to his announcement in February that Britain was going to hand the problem back to the United Nations. Problem being, or Palestine being given to the British by the League of Nations, and the United Nations was the successor organization, so they were giving it back to the United Nations and let them solve the problem we were leaving. And as I say, the further acts of terrorism consolidated the British determination or decision. In other words, there may have been a decision in February. Some people doubted whether the British would really carry it out, whether this was really sincere. But in the end, further acts of terrorism made sure that the British would abide by what they had stated and leave the country. That's it.
Thank you both, Bruce and Benny. And I'm actually I didn't know what they were talking about exactly, but I was happy about this division to history and historiography, because I think that's also an important part in the works of both of you, the historical account, but also when you look at Benny Morris's work, he actually created the term, the new historians, and he was, of course, one of the first so-called new historians in the 1980s and 90s in Israel, who tried to look different at events, and I think he then maybe looked different again at events, but we can talk about this in our discussion. We'll start with the question about the different groups, and of course they were mentioned here a few times. Maybe starting with Bruce, could you say a few more words about the different tactics of the groups, the different strategies, and also, and especially between the two more right-wing groups, the Irgun, or the revisionists on the one hand, and Lehi, the Stern gang, as they were often called, on the other hand, which of course both had future prime ministers. You mentioned Begin, and of course Yitzhak Shamir was with the Stern group. Also, there was, and maybe my question started with that, there were different approaches towards the Germans and Italians, the Axis powers during the Second World War. Maybe you want to say a few words about this.
Sure. Well, there were three main underground groups, of course. The Haganah, which literally means defense, and as Benny said, was really the embryonic encapsulation of what became the Israel Defense Forces. Following the 1929 riots, a group of Haganah men decided that purely defensive tactics and a purely self-defense militia was inappropriate or irrelevant to this greater threat that had been posed by these widespread riots. And they broke off and founded what initially they called the Haganah Bet, or the Haganah B, and then in 1937 actually formally adopts the name of National Military Organization and the acronym Etzel. Very closely allied with the revisionist party of Vladimir Jabotinsky, advocated a very muscular, I would say, aggressive view of Zionism. I think the Irgun's slogan says it all. It was a fist clasping a rifle against a backdrop of both sides of the River Jordan. In other words, their vision of a Jewish national home was not restricted only to Palestine, but included Transjordan, or the present Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as well. And they believed that there should be a fusion of both those territories. The Lehi was in turn a splinter or an offshoot of the Irgun, and the faction broke away in the end of 1939, the beginning of 1940, precisely over what I described was the Irgun's decision to suspend its revolt. It had risen up against Britain, as I described after the 1939 White Paper. One of the key senior officers in the Irgun was, I think, a phenomenally or fantastically interesting individual, Avraham Stern, who was simultaneously a poet and a dandy, a womanizer, and a zealous fanatic. And his fanaticism, I think, was illustrated in the point that Michael alluded to, is that he, and this I think is another important factor, is that terrorist groups, if they're successful, study one another and learn from one another. And one of the most startling things I discovered in researching this book is that a copy of Menachem Begin's book, The Revolt, was found in Al-Qaeda's very well-stocked library in Kandahar, Afghanistan, as well as many other books about the Irgun. Bin Laden was interested in the Irgun, actually, as Benny was talking about. I don't think anybody could really teach Al-Qaeda anything about terrorism, but what they were interested in was Begin's transition from a terrorist, from a freedom fighter, to a parliamentarian, to leader of the opposition, and then to a prime minister, which is a chilling thought in its own right, that bin Laden thought that he could become legitimate. But in any event, Stern studied very closely the experience of the Irish revolutionaries. And they, of course, in the 1916 Easter Uprising, rose up against British rule at what they determined was precisely the most opportune moment, when Britain was enmeshed in World War I, and therefore distracted, and the Irish hoped they could wrest their freedom. Stern had the exact same idea, and in pursuit of that goal, actually attempted to forge an alliance with Nazi Germany. In fact, a very senior emissary was arrested by British intelligence en route to Beirut in 1941 to meet with the Nazis. And basically, Stern, this is of course at least a year or more before the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was embraced. And Stern had family, of course, that was left behind in Poland, including his parents, so doubtlessly there was a personal motive in this, but he was offering to solve Hitler's Jewish problem for him by offering to absorb all the Jews if Hitler would just expel them from Europe, let them go to Palestine, and Stern promised that then a Jewish army would rise up and together they would defeat the British Empire. And one of the most interesting documents I found in the course of my research was a memo written by Cordell Hull, FDR's Secretary of State, about his meeting exactly this period with the Polish ambassador in exile, where they're discussing the Stern gang's, Abraham Stern's mad schemes and the intelligence reports that they're receiving from the Middle East of these overtures. In a nutshell, Lehi was always much smaller, only 200 to 400 men versus, and I'm talking about actual gunmen and operatives, fighters, as opposed to about, I would say, 1,000 to 2,500. The numbers always varied of the Irgun. Consequently, Lehi relied on a policy mostly of individual assassination. And as I said, they assassinated Lord Moyne, who was a senior British cabinet official resident in the Middle East. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch, but I have to end by saying there was a constant, this was a very dynamic phenomenon, and arch enemies often found themselves close allies. So following the assassination of Lord Moyne, the British enlisted the Jewish Agency and the Haganah to hunt down the Jewish terrorists, ostensibly who were responsible for killing this British cabinet minister, a longtime friend and political ally of Winston Churchill. But the Jewish agency, the Haganah, turned their attention not to the Lehi, the numerically inferior, mostly inconsequential group, but rather to their much more formidable opponents in the revisionist party, in the Irgun, and this was what was known as the season. So basically, the Haganah arrested and interned Irgun fighters and turned them over to the British. But then you have at the end of the war, the Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah cooperating with one another in a united resistance movement, and even jointly planning the attack on the King David Hotel.
Benny, you want to say something about this? I just want to add the question, because this came up a few times. What is the difference, in your opinion, you brought this up too, between a terrorist movement and a freedom movement?
I just wanted to make one or two comments to, in fact, reinforce what Bruce was saying. Sorry, is this on?
We just have to be very close to it.
Okay. I wanted just to reinforce something that Bruce had said. Terrorist or revolutionary movements learning from one another and reinforcing each other in some way. Yitzhak Shamir, one of the three heads of the Lehi during its last years, who became Israeli prime minister after Begin, his code name was Michael, or Michael, which was on the basis of Michael Collins' name. Michael Collins was one of the revolutionaries in Ireland who fought against the British. And so he so admired them that he took one of the Irish rebels' names. A second thing I thought worth mentioning is that the LHI, which is commonly called a right-wing organization, was actually an amalgam of right-wingers and extreme left-wingers. In other words, if you want to call it proto-fascists or ultra-right-wingers that you would call them today, and communists. There were communists and semi-communists in the ranks of the LHI. And of course, what brought them together was anti-imperialism. Both hated the British. The right-wingers and the left-wingers wanted the British out of Palestine, and so they joined together. So you find in 1948 that they're running in sort of to get together in Israel's first parliamentary election, which they're unsuccessful at in early 1949. And Shamir, in fact, quite often referred to to Lenin as one of his idols. Shamir, the head of the Lehi, essentially refers to Lenin as one of the people he most admires. Incidentally, one of the people most admired as well by Ben Gurion, Lenin. About the question which Michael asked about terrorism, well, I would say that simplistically, that the definition should be, and both terrorism, of course, intends to generate fear, sometimes counter insurgency, which will bring more members into the terrorist insurgency. But terrorism usually aims to hit civilians, and national liberation movements, when they're acting as guerrilla fighters and not as terrorists, fight against armies or forces of occupation. This is how I would put it. The Hezbollah fighting Israeli troops in southern Lebanon is a national liberation organization or national resistance guerrilla movement. It's not terrorists, even if Israelis call them terrorists. On the other hand, when the Hezbollah is shelling Kiryat Shmone and trying to target civilians specifically, it's acting as a terrorist organization. That's the way I would define it. It's a bit simplistic, but I think it's not bad. And so when you talk about the Irgun, when it's killing Arabs in large numbers in bus stations and in marketplaces in 1938 in Palestine, countering Arab terrorism against Jews, it's acting as a terrorist organization. When it's attacking the British between 1945 and 1947 and taking care not to kill British civilians, usually, but killing only troops and police, it's acting as a national liberation organization. The LHI was less meticulous and usually targeted whoever they could get hold of, including Jews, incidentally, they occasionally killed. So did, of course, the Irgun kill Jews here and there they considered informers, and the Haganah also here and there killed Jewish informers.
Could I offer just a brief explanation? I may be unique in the world today that I don't view terrorism as a necessarily pejorative word. And as someone who's studied it for so long, I view myself as almost like a clinician or an oncologist.
Or sympathetic.
Words, but I chose to use the word, though, for a specific reason. I mean, at the time, this was the terminology used, obviously by the British, of course, but also by the Jewish community and by the Jewish Agency and by the Haganah to describe the dissident organizations, to describe Etzel and Lehi. There was also another big difference. Today, this is a word that's generally avoided. In fact, the BBC, very proudly after the Paris attacks, one of their directors said, "We don't use the word terrorism, it's a value-laden word. We prefer to use, I think, words of obfuscation, guerrillas, fighters, gunmen, all this kind of thing." Militants. Back then, though, when you look, whatever newspaper, Palestine Post, Haaretz, the Times of London, the BBC itself, the New York Times, that term terrorism was used to describe these groups. So I thought it was, accurate. I think you have to view these issues as the way they were looked at the time. I mean, there is a debate, I think, and I make the point in the book that even though I call these groups terrorist groups, there's a world of difference between the terrorism that they practice, just as Benny described, where their primary aim, they did not make a fetish, as terrorists do today, of attacking civilians. But at the same time, though, there were often British civilians killed, whether deliberately or inadvertently. But that's, in essence, I personally am not making a value judgment by using that term. I'm trying to use the term that was used at the time, and I'm trying to differentiate what went on then from what occurs today.
You're the terrorism expert. I'm not. But from my simplistic view, it's often the outside world which would call the others the terrorist group, and they themselves call themselves the National Liberation Movement. But there are, of course, differences, and we can discuss this more. I just want to make a final point and then we'll open it up. I think just as sometimes it's not so easy to know how to use this terminology of terrorism or national liberation groups, left and right is, as we just heard, not so easy either. And I'm just thinking actually of Jabotinsky himself. If you read Jabotinsky's writings, I think a lot of people would be quite astonished today. He was in many ways a liberal. He was, of course, a cosmopolitan in all of his experiences, and especially his last book, Jews in the War Front, which was published in 1940, actually just after he died. He makes some remarkable observations, and in a way, his state is his solution is a one-state solution. And he says, if there is a Jewish prime minister, there should be an Arab vice prime minister, and vice versa. So, of course, he has, as you said, he has a very large territory in mind. This includes today's Jordan as well. But it is interesting. So I think it's very hard sometimes to distinguish between right and left. I don't know if you want to say a few more words about Jabotinsky's role in this struggle. Of course, he died in 1940, but I think his legacy is very important for the establishment of the state as well.
Well, I'm not an expert on Jabotinsky. One thing I know and would say is that Jabotinsky was circumspect, even critical of the ICL's terrorism against Arab civilians. This wasn't something he managed. He was out of the country, out of Palestine at the time, but he was critical of the way they were waging their campaign against the Arabs. In this sense, as you say, he was a sort of a liberal and enlightened person.
I mean, I think he's another endlessly fascinating character in the book. I mean, firstly, he was always an Anglophile. He always believed in British democracy and faithfully, despite evidence to the contrary, still had this abiding faith that British would fulfill its commitment to create the Jewish national home. So he was very much, he saw things, I think he's often caricatured as being a fascist. I would see that he was very much more liberal. But I think what always struck me about him is that one of his differences with the Labor Party, with Labor Zionism, was that, and this is, I think, an argument that we see used often in recent decades in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that Jabotinsky was dismissive of the fact that the Arabs could ever be bought off, that somehow raising the socioeconomic status of both peoples would, in fact, in some way assuage Arab discontent or would in some way negate or nullify their own nationalist learnings or somehow cancel out their own religious nationalist desires for Palestine. And that's why, of course, in his famous 1923 article, The Iron Wall, he said that we're never going to buy off or bribe the Arabs, and much like there's a separation barrier today, that's exactly what he was advocating, is some separation as well, if there could not be a political accommodation.
Okay, let's open it up. So, yeah, Laura. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Jason. To what extent did the British deliberately set the Jewish and Arab populations against each other as part of a divide and conquer strategy, like they did in much of the rest of the British Empire?
No, that's a very interesting question. In fact, that was, as you just noted, that was exactly their modus operandi, and that's what also astonishing me in looking at a lot of the Arab newspapers at the time, that they were, just as even more suspicious of British intentions than the Jews were, actually, and were always on the. From the Zionist perspective, Zionism had been betrayed by the 1939 White Paper and then by all these intermediate steps that I described. So you would think that that's somewhat surprising from the Arab side, but they regarded the British as completely duplicitous, and they regarded them as duplicitous firstly with the Balfour Declaration, then in allowing Jewish immigration, then in tolerating what it saw was the seditious activities of the Jewish Agency, and constantly compared the British response to all forms of illegal Jewish activities, from illegal immigration to actual violence to terrorism, with the very brutal, absolutely brutal suppression of the Arab rebellion, when you had, the whole panoply of counterterrorism in terms of waterboarding, villages being bombed and shelled, houses being demolished, entire villages often being implicated and collectively punished for activities. Now, the interesting thing is that both the Irgun and the Lehi, in their propaganda, up until, and my book stops in September 1947 when Britain hands the problem over to the United Nations. So up until that point, Benny, of course, is the expert in the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948. But it's interesting from what I saw, right up until that point, both the Irgun and the Lehi, in their propaganda, whether this was ingenuous or not, were always appealing to Palestine's Arab to join in this anti-imperialist struggle. Lehi in particular, because that was part of Stern's vision as well. But I was very surprised to find the same sort of overtures from the Irgun. None of them were ever answered, of course, and the two were always at loggerheads. But certainly I would argue, yes, the British did actively, I think, sow this sense of discord.
Can I add something? Being an Anglophile, I would dispute the belief at the time of the Arabs and also of the Jews that the British were employing divide and conquer, divide and rule tactics. I don't think this was Britain's intention. I don't think this is how they organized their policy. It may have looked that way to each side, or some people on each side, but this wasn't British policy. There was a lot of confusion in British policy, but it certainly wasn't organized around the principle of divide and rule.
I'm curious about the sources that you mentioned, archives in London and in New York and in Israel. Are there any sources in the Arab world that would shed light on the same events?
At least that I could find no books. For instance, Arab newspapers were the richest source of information, but there were no sort of histories of this period in the sense that you have a wealth of literature on both the Zionist side, but also, Israeli historians like Yehoshua Porath, who have written, I think, enormously important books on the Arab side as well.
Yeah, no, you're pointing to a great problem and disparity, which is the absence of Arab source material, Arab documentation. Many Arabs were illiterate. They did not preserve documents. They didn't have state structures. Their clandestine organizations were not particularly literate. They just didn't leave documentation. So, and the same applies to Palestine's Arabs. So all documentation, in fact, which Bruce uses, is basically Israeli or British, maybe some American documents as well, but essentially it's British and Jewish documents, which
Mr. Hoffman, early on you mentioned the fact that the UK missed the opportunity to engage the United States. And my question is, what do you think would have happened if they had engaged the United States?
Well, I think this is, one of the, perhaps, the most controversial parts of the book, at least in my view, because Churchill, I believe, at least, and I argue in the book, Churchill had, of course, been a lifelong Zionist. From the time that he was first elected to Parliament at the turn of 2 centuries ago in Manchester, there was a large Jewish constituency. And even though it was his political party, the Conservatives, that had imposed the 1939 White Paper, he was always an implacable opponent of it. And once in office in 1943, he had convened a special cabinet committee to put forth a plan of partition. This is a plan that had originally been proposed in 1937 by a royal commission and had been rejected. And Churchill's view was that this was really the only solution. And in fact, in the archives, one finds that his plan, and this is one of the tragedies, I think, this is the other side of terrorism, where terrorism often can dash political solutions. There's this very moving account found both in the Weizmann archives in Rehovot and also in the British archives of a meeting on the weekend of November 1st and 2nd, 1944, where Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization, is invited to the prime ministerial retreat at Chequers. And there, Weizmann says, I understand there's been this cabinet committee, but we don't know we haven't heard anything of what they're going to recommend, and I'm very concerned that the proposed Jewish state will be too small and economically not viable. And Churchill assures him that, firstly, he has packed this committee with all of Zionism's closest friends, Leo Amory and others. And then he says, secondly, something to the effect that I promise you that you will, stick your thumb in this pie and pull out a plum piece. But he says we have to wait until the U.S. presidential elections the following Tuesday to ensure that Franklin Roosevelt is reelected. And of course, on the Monday is when the Stern Gang Lehi assassinates Lord Moyne, British cabinet minister, a very old friend of Churchill's, very close political ally. And Churchill then turns his back on this partition plan, and it dies. Now, why I think it's so important is because in the documents, one sees that Churchill's plan was to get Franklin Roosevelt on board, and then to hold the third Big Three conference, which eventually happened in Yalta, but in fact to hold it in February 1945 or March 1945 in Jerusalem, where he sought to then obtain Marshal Stalin's consent to this, and then backed by the Big Three, by the United States, Britain, and Russia, to agree to implement a post-war partition. But of course, it's the assassination of Moyne that completely destroys that. The Labor Party embarks on a fruitless courting of the United States through the Anglo-American Commission to try to bring the United States in. Truman will have no part of it because he sees that this is going to require American bayonets to enforce. And basically, with the failure of the Anglo-American Commission, Britain has to decide what it's going to do about Palestine, which renders it very vulnerable to the actions of the Irgun and Lehi.
Okay. Here?
Yeah, Susan Becker, a friend of the center. Would you comment, could you comment if there was any role on the partisans who came from Europe at the end of the war on the Aliyah Bet and what their role was in the conflict at that time?
Well, you've just hit the third rail of British fears because, all the parties, the Haganah, Etzel, Lehi, were all attempting to recruit partisans from World War II and had experience in the Warsaw Ghetto, fighting in the forests of Eastern Europe. And there's British documents that I cite in the book that talk about the large influx of these fighters and the force multiplying effect that they especially had on the Irgun, giving it enhanced, firstly, training and knowledge, but also all these groups, too, wasn't just partisans. There were also veterans of having fought alongside the British. Dov Gruner, who was actually hanged by the British, had been a distinguished, a very highly decorated NCO, non-commissioned officer in the British Army fighting in North Africa.
And that's why the two British guys were hung because of that.
Right.
Yeah, your discussion regarding the period of time when the British mandate was in effect, and you're talking about the trickle in effect of Jews from Europe into then Palestine. about that period of time, but nobody talked about, I think it was the Root Commission, and correct me on that. Wasn't there a report of the massive immigration of Arabs from surrounding Arab countries into the Mandate area to the point where the British could not even count the quantity of them, and those are the fathers and the grandfathers of what you see today. But what was the British role at that time with this massive immigration? As I think Ephraim Kirsch reported it, and I think there were several others who also reported. Then the second one is when you mention terrorism, I haven't heard the word ideology used as a synonym or whatever as part of what terrorism is today. What we're seeing, I think, is that terrorism is something different, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, about Arab immigration to Palestine, there was official immigration and there was unofficial immigration. Official being with British permission, and people did come from Jordan and Syria and Lebanon mainly into Palestine, often seasonally to pick oranges or whatever and then to go back. But the numbers were actually very small of those coming in for permanent residency. We're talking about hundreds per year, not more. The question then arises how many crossed the Jordan and entered Palestine and stayed there, not seasonally and not officially, but illegally. And nobody actually has a number, nobody knows. But I think most historical demographers, social historians would say that the numbers weren't that large. That is, there wasn't this what you call massive immigration of Arabs into Palestine during the British Mandate, illegally entering and staying in Palestine. This isn't true. There's a lot of propaganda around the subject because the argument being that if a lot of them were recent, a lot of Arabs in Palestine in 1947, 48 were recent illegal immigrants into Palestine, then it reduces the number of people who actually became real refugees from Palestine because they weren't really residents of Palestine or not legitimate residents, and therefore lessens guilt, if there is guilt attached, to the creation of the refugee problem. But the numbers were apparently quite small. As incidentally, the number of illegal Jewish immigrants to Palestine was much smaller, at least until 1945, than legal immigrants to Palestine. Yes,
Victor Miller. For so many years that I've been intensely interested in this problem, I'm always fascinated by the depth of, or by the vehemence of the enmity between the two peoples. What do you, as historians, what do you believe was the seminal event, if there was one seminal event that really let us go to the bottom and remain there for, in terms of the opposition between the two communities? Was there any one event or series of events that created enmity between these two communities that for the next few generations will live on to haunt us?
Well, I don't know of any event. There was no event. It's true that the Arabs begin to count, Palestinian Arabs formally, officially begin to count the clash between Zionism and the Palestinian Arabs from 1917, even though it actually began years before. 1917 being the Balfour Declaration as the event which in some way triggered the conflict as they see it. But it's not true. It didn't trigger the conflict. The conflict was there incipient before then. The Balfour Declaration probably exacerbated it in some way. But there is no event. It's simply an antagonism between two peoples fighting over a piece of land, and in the Arabs' case, also aggravated by religious animosity.
But why is vehemence?
Religious animosity adds vehemence to political struggle.
I was anxious for Benny to answer that because, of course, his seminal, extremely important book, Righteous Victims, really examines this issue in greater detail than certainly my book does. But if I had to, be very, horribly reductionist and sort of, bring it down to its base level, I actually do think, but again, I'm coming at it not as a Zionist or a Middle Eastern historian, but as a terrorism specialist. I really think that the 1929 riots were a turning point. I mean, Benny is absolutely right. Going back to 1918, there was a Muslim-Christian association that was formed specifically to oppose the immigration of Jews to Palestine. So it spanned both, Muslims and Christian Arabs in the country. But I still think, in looking at that early history, that was the point of no return, because that was where I think, particularly Haj Amin al-Husseini was able to mobilize the masses of people to take something that had hitherto been localized riots that had maybe spread to the outskirts, but to turn it now into a nationwide uprising. And that all came down to, I think, as I described earlier, this fusion of religion and politics, because of course the 1929 riots began, I mean, the genesis of it was a year earlier when some Jews had brought a bench to the Western Wall. I mean, the Western Wall was nothing like it is today with a wide, very commodious plaza. I mean, that was a very densely packed, inhabited area. And to be more comfortable, they brought a bench in. And the Muslims regarded this as inappropriately affecting the status quo that had been maintained, that there had been no changes to the holy precincts. And it was, I think, Haj Amin's ability to mobilize the masses that really turned this into a conflict that was very difficult to resolve subsequently.
I'll just give my comment as well, since you asked all of us. I mean, everyone picks his or her own favorite event or development, and I think what is really crucial are the global developments during and especially after World War I, when we have a movement towards national states. And I think that, if you look at Zionism, there was talk about a national home in Palestine, both in the original Zionist documents and the Herzl, but even in the Balfour Declaration. It doesn't talk about a state. Slowly, I think after World War I, it becomes clear that the whole world, especially Europe and the Middle East, are changing, and Jews did not live under, usually, a national state. They lived in multinational empires, be it the Tsarist Empire, which is not just Russia, included Poland and Lithuania and many other places, and of course the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire. And after World War I, the whole world order changed, and every nation, big or small, tries to get their own state, and so do the Jews. It was not clear, in my interpretation at least, that for Herzl, the Jewish state, although he called his book The Jewish State, was an independent state as we today consider the state of Israel. If you read it carefully, that's not the case. But after World War I, it changes. When Lithuania is a state, and when Estonia is a state, and when other states seem to emerge in the Middle East as well, Jordan and Lebanon and others, then the Jewish state slowly becomes a state of Israel. But that's, of course, all of these factors are important. Please.
I'm going to ask a contrary question. We had certainly people in the Jewish community, not many, but some, who saw a possibility of coexistence of Arabs, Muslims, and Jews. And they were certainly a very small minority. In the Muslim community, in the Arab community, were there people who saw some positive possibilities with Israelis or Jews becoming an important power there? Or was the nationalist movement an impetus so strong that people simply couldn't see any positive derivatives of this influx of Jews in that part of the world?
As far as I know, and I have sort of studied the material, there weren't Palestinian Arabs who were ready to accept the Jewish sovereign presence in Palestine, in any part of Palestine. 5%, 10%, 20%, none were willing to have a partition in which there was a Jewish state, and also none were willing to enter into a binational state, in other words, some sort of state with Jews and Arabs in which they would share power on a basis maybe of parity. There were no Arabs. There were one or two who tried to bridge the gap, and I'm talking really about one or two, not dozens or thousands, and more often than not, these one or two were shot. by Arabs who just believed that all of Palestine should be Arab. So I don't think there was a possibility, given that they were unwilling. But it's also true that on the Zionist side, the Zionists were hell-bent on establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, either all over the whole of Palestine or over a part of it, but a Jewish state. And binationalism was very weak among the Jews. It did have supporters, but it was very weak. But on the Arab side, it had no supporters.
Hi. I understand your definition of terrorism as it pertains to the Middle East in the 1930s to 50s. But I wonder if you have a contemporary model for terrorism in today's world. For example, by your definition, 9/11 was a terrorist attack. The killing of soldiers by Major Hassan on an army base was not a terrorist attack. Was the killing at Sandy Hook by a person with a gun a terrorist attack? Is there a simple way to define the term in the contemporary world?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think there is a simple way. I think the general rule of thumb for a definition of terrorism, which David Fromkin wrote about in Foreign Affairs in 1975, is it depends on whether you sympathize with the victims or whether you sympathize with the perpetrators. If you sympathize with the victims, it's terrorism. If you sympathize with the perpetrators, then freedom fighters, nationalists, guerrillas, or whatever. In my view, in my definition, Major Hassan's act would definitely be an act of terrorism. And if you look actually at the State Department's definition, it makes the exact point that terrorism includes attacks on non-combatants, that soldiers not deployed in a war zone or engaged actually in hostile operations are considered civilians in that context, and indeed many of the people that he killed were not soldiers but were civilian workers. Sandy Hook, as tragic and heinous as it was, is not a terrorist incident because it's devoid of any political motive. It was the warped and twisted fantasies of a very disturbed young man. The question is, when our diplomats are killed, of course, or when our civilian USAID worker is killed or journalists are killed, we call it terrorists. And that's why I'm not, discomforted calling the Irgun and Lehi terrorists as well, because they did kill British civilians. Again, it was not their primary aim. It was not the fetish, as it is of many terrorist groups today, to kill civilians. But they did. They attacked the Palestine Broadcasting Company. They attacked railway yards. They attacked docks, and civilians were killed. And there is a responsibility and a culpability for that. But I think, another book I've written, Inside Terrorism, which spends a whole chapter discussing these definitional issues. And I think, in a nutshell, what terrorism is defined as is violence or the threat of violence calculated to achieve far-reaching political change and to create a psychological climate of fear and anxiety in pursuit of the terrorist's aims. Now, that's at least as narrow as I can get, but of course it's elastic to include many other things that we wouldn't necessarily include terrorism. But then, there's no agreement on what war is, how to define war, how to define democracy, how to define imperialism. We have a presidential election that's having trouble defining lots of terms. And I think terrorism, unfortunately, is one of those things, too, that you could hopefully arrive at one normative, consensual definition, but it's not going to be an exact science.
Okay, I see 1, 2 more, and I think where's the mic?
I have it.
3 more, okay.
Yes, Bruce, I know your book is mostly focused on Israel and the British, and it ends in 1947, but a few months into 1948, we have an attack that Benny referred to quite briefly at Deir Yassin, undertaken mostly by Etzel and Lehi. I think that's probably something you probably didn't get into in your book, because it is a seminal event in Israeli history, and I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on it, even though it happened after the time frame you're looking at. I don't think 3 months is terribly long.
Well, Deir Yassin would have been, it wasn't the reason that I ended the book in September 1947, but it would have been sufficient reason. And I'm going to turn to Benny in a second, because of course he has written on it. During the first Arab-Israeli war, there were atrocities committed by both sides. And, Benny also in much of his work has, shed light on discomforting aspects of Zionist history. But, that's still, that to me is different. That was committed in the course of warfare between both sides. It's not the terrorism that I'm necessarily talking about, which is resistance to what was, British rule at the time. And in warfare, civilians are killed, often brutally, by both sides. That's not to explain or condone it, but I think it's a very different context than what I was writing about.
I'm not sure what the question is. What happened at Deir Yassin?
Yeah. Well, I think the question was addressed probably why it wasn't moved, so we'll go to, yes, please?
My question is about going back to...
Can you speak up a little bit? Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks. My name is Dan Hyman. I'm actually a graduate of AU. But my question is going back to the tensions between the Haganah and the Irgun and the Lehi. How close did they come to outright civil war? You mentioned the season and informing on each other. How did they avoid coming to open war?
At least, in my view, it was Begin, actually, had forbid any kind of retaliation by the Irgun against the Haganah. And, in the book, there are accounts from the British, not by, let's say biased accounts by Irgun people who were imprisoned by the Haganah, of really bestial conditions of individuals whose teeth were being pulled out, who were kept, chained naked in the cave. The worst kinds of excesses. And Begin had refused to descend into any kind of civil war. He just thought that that would completely undermine the Irgun's credibility, would be to the detriment of the Zionist cause, and he hoped to patiently wait it out. And what happened is exactly as he envisioned. The revolt is an enormously subjective and in many respects an untrustworthy book, although I think it's an absolutely critically important revolutionary text. But in this case, he was right. He writes in the revolt that eventually he hoped that this period would pass and that the Zionist underground forces would be united. And for a brief period from the end of World War II in 1945 until the King David Hotel bombing, they were jointly united, and then they went their own ways. The Haganah concentrated not on offensive operations against the British, as the Irgun and Lehi proceeded to, or continued, but rather they focused then on illegal immigration. Irgun also was involved in illegal immigration, although not to the extent that the Haganah was. But I think that was the reason that civil war was avoided.
I think that it was avoided by both sides. That is, both sides, the idea of Jews killing Jews, which had happened during the Great Revolt against Rome around the year 70 AD, and was pointed at as one of the reasons for the failure of the revolt against the Romans, Jews fighting, different factions fighting each other. Both sides didn't want a repeat of this, though it's true that the Haganah did in some way persecute Irgun and Lehi, but especially Irgun people, for a short period. And it's also true that in the midst of the 1948 war, during one of the truces, the Haganah did clamp down on the IZL, shelled one of its boats, sank one of its boats, bringing both immigrants and arms from France to Palestine. Ben Gurion wanted to make a point, and a state should have one army, not a number of armies. And the Etzel, in some way, was trying to violate this principle. But both sides essentially avoided, I think, tried to avoid civil war, were successful in that.
Can I just talk about, one important post-war fact that Benny has mentioned, but I want to elaborate on. In September 1948, the Lehi assassinated Count Folke Bernadotte, who was the UN mediator in Jerusalem, and immediately, exactly for the same reasons that you described, that Ben Gurion clamped down on the Irgun's import of arms, the new Israeli state immediately outlawed the Lehi, put prices on the head of Shamir and the other two leaders of the organization, interned without trial indefinitely. They basically invoked those same laws that the British had used against Arab and Jewish terrorists, or the Arab and Jewish underground. Ben-Gurion invoked those same laws basically to completely eviscerate the Lehi, and these people were, nearly 250 members were held indefinitely without charges brought against them. And it was only when they swore loyalty to the state that they were freed. Shamir himself had to flee the country and wasn't allowed to return to Israel until 1956. And then when he did return, he joined the Mossad, actually.
Go here first? Yeah.
Yes, my question deals with a little different side of terrorism that's not really here. We talked about it tactically, but emotionally, it is what it has a strong appeal to. Any oppressed people or repressed people sees an expression of power. I remember the Islamic courts guy in Somalia saying, when we bombed Kenya, they murdered people in Kenya, and they said, it makes them cry, it's a good thing. And there's something about the spectacle of violence, or Michael Collins, when he appeared in an Irish uniform, people cavelled. There's something about, we are under the thumb of everybody else. Now we are making them fear. And that emotional aspect is a good part of the effect of it. You know, the purpose of terrorism is terrorism.
Well, I would say, the purpose of it really is to compensate for military inferiority. Is that terrorists know that they cannot defeat their military, they're more numerous, more powerful, better armed state opponents. So they resort, exactly as you described, to playing on people's emotions and generating an atmosphere of fear and concern that they hope to manipulate to their advantage. And they hope to force governments, and this was also very much Menachem Begin's strategy of polarization, where it's to catalyze a population against the ruling power and in favor of those who claim to be the true defenders of the people, in other words.
She asked me to introduce myself. My name is Matthew Hogan. I'm honored that Professor Morris has assigned my Dayerstein paper, even if he disagrees with it, I believe, in his courses.
Hi, Keith Darden, a professor here at SIS. Most of the discussion has been about British withdrawal, essentially violence to secure British withdrawal, which I think it's not unrelated to the creation of the State of Israel, but it is not the key component. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relative organizational strength of these groups, in other words, creating proto-states, rather than just getting the British out. The key component of creating a state is the structure of the movement and the organization that's going to replace that governance. That's what most movements lack, and that's what Zionism had and made it successful.
Well, the labor movement, and with its various parties and agencies of pre-state government, created essentially the organizational structure for the emergence of a Jewish state, so that the moment the state was declared on the 14th of May, the Jewish agency's political department changes into the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and the Haganah changes into the IDF, and so on. The IZL and Lehi have absolutely no part in this state creation. It's all a creation of a mechanism of the labor movement and its pre-state agencies like the Jewish Agency, the Histadrut, the Jewish National Fund, the Haganah, etc. All of these in some way are converted to state agencies. Is that what you were asking? Yeah.
One more.
Hi, I'd like to go back to the question of Deir Yassin that was asked about earlier, and we just slithered away from it. In the United States, what happened to Deir Yassin is the third rail of this time. It's someplace that is immediately fraught with all kinds of argumentation. Indeed, I don't think Deir Yassin is, I think it's hardly used without the adjective of a massacre. And therefore, I know you discuss it in your book, but I'd like you to fill out some of the intricacies of what really happened and what your position is of what happened to Deir Yassin.
What's the question?
Are you asking
his, what
Are you asking
happened?
me? I don't mention it in my book, so.
No, I said to Dr. Morris.
I have no position on Deir Yassin. All I do in my books and the article I wrote on the subject is describe what happened, why it happened, what consequences emerged from what happened, but I describe what happened. I have no position. What I found and what I think reasonable historians have found in relation to what happened in Deir Yassin, and there's a big book incidentally coming out on Deir Yassin in the coming months, I think, in Israel, is that there was a conquest of the village by troops of the IZL and the Lehi. They found it hard going, 120 soldiers found it hard going taking over that village. They suffered casualties, 5 dead and 20 wounded out of a force of 120, which is a large proportion of casualties. They called in some small support from the Haganah, and the small Palmach unit joined in the fighting at some point. And in the course of the fighting, they blew up houses, they threw grenades into houses, killing people. They shot people running out into the street, and maybe they killed a few of the captured captives who fell into their hands in the course of the day and even in the next day. It wasn't a massacre of the nature of lining up 50 unarmed people and shooting them against the wall. That didn't happen. What happened was piecemeal killings with atrocities among the killings in the course of a battle. All told, probably about 110 of the villagers died, some of them armed people, most of them probably civilians, not the number then broadcast by the IZL, the British, and the Haganah of 250 dead. It was about 110 according to the latest Arab research, and they went family by family to find out who had actually died there. It was altogether a large atrocity, or a series of atrocities which you can characterize as a massacre, and it had tremendous impact. The impact being that it was taken up, the subject, the story, by Arab radio broadcasts, and it instilled a great deal of fear among the Arab population of Palestine, and facilitated, contributed to the mass flight of Arabs, which began, in fact, in April, a few days or before or after the Deir Yassin massacre of the 9th of April.
Well, I think we could go on for a long time, but this is only one of, I think, quite a few events which we will hosting in the next few weeks, which discuss questions like this. The next one, in fact, is Daniel Gordis in 2 weeks speaking about Begin, about Menachem Begin. So really a lot of these ideas will continue, we will discuss them. We have 2 more major events in the first week of April. April 4th, the Israeli writer Eshkol Nevo, and April 6th, the Israeli journalist Ben-Dror Yemini. So all of these opinions and discussions, I think, will contribute to what we've heard today. I think we really heard a very informative discussion, and I appreciate that a lot, because sometimes these topics are so loaded with emotions, but I think today was a wonderful example of how we can talk about these difficult issues in a very informative way. So I would like to thank the audience, first of all. I know there was a lot of competition watching the outcome of the diverse primaries tonight. We can do that now. I would like to thank also the School of Public Affairs for co-sponsoring the event, and of course, most of all the speakers of tonight. Thank you very much.